All right, so we our last leg of the class, and normally I was looking at our schedule. Normally we're like a week later, so we're actually a little bit ahead schedule of the where we need to be. So this is good. I usually feel rushed at the end of the semester going over this material, and this is more of the almost like a capstone, if you will, of this semester, looking at outside of that first exam where you're looking at the basic biomechanics, but looking at like muscle physiology, cardiovascular function, nervous system, and then endocrine response, we're getting into the nutritional perspective, and we're also getting into the lifestyle aspects, the things that affect metabolism, growth hormone output, and so forth. So it's a good semester, or a good we're at a good pace, and it's good material. I posted all the videos. I got everything done. So I got all the videos for at least the next module for nutrition, and I updated all of them. I compared to, I don't know if you guys have been looking at any of the old videos, but when you look at the old videos compared to the new videos, it's like night and day difference, right? They're a little longer, a little bit more content, but I've expanded it out a little bit, and I think they've been more accessible. And the performance on the exams has been much better this semester, and I think it's because of the video content. So it's good. So module 9, let me flip over to the screen here. Unit 4 has 3 modules. It really only has 2 modules. It has nutrition and metabolism. And module 9 is going to be your basic nutritional stuff. And this, your textbook for the essentials of strength and conditioning, it has a nutrition aspect, but it's really baseline. So the first video I posted, which is just guidelines, let's see, this is the essentials. This is the one. Yeah, nutrition in the personal training setting. So if you look over here, I have 4 videos posted right now. You have video 9.1, which is guidelines and energy balance. For all practical purposes, this is your scope in the fitness field. Illinois has one of the most restrictive scope of practices for not restrictive, actually the most broad for the role of a registered dietitian, but most restrictive for everyone outside of that. And some states, like, you can write down supplements and give meal plans, and you really can't do any of that here in Illinois. Very protective of the dying field of registered dietitian. I mean, it's going nowhere, right? It's going down the toilet. Registered dietitians are mostly in hospital settings, and what they're really doing is recommending the food guide pyramid or the USDA recommendations, which is now the MyPlate, calorie counts, and being really specific on like meal planning. You don't want to have anything to do with that, not because it's outside the scope of your practice, because that's probably the worst advice or worst time spent with a client is counting calories, going over meal plans, and specific foods to eat, right? It's hogwash. What you want to do, and this is what this first video gets into, is you are a provider of education. Your role as a personal trainer, as a coach, is to empower the individual so they can start making choices on their own. And the only way they can do that is through learning. And the only way they can do that is through education. And there are a plethora of resources online. There's actually more than enough resources. There's too much. And so you don't really have to provide any content. You more have to curate and direct your client into certain areas. And you want them to do this journey on their own. You'll be their guide and their coach, but the more of the interaction is going to be, well, this is what a carbohydrate is, and this is the effect it has on the body. And this is what a protein is, and this is the effect it has on the body. So you're going to be focusing more on macronutrients than you are on total calories. And then when it comes to eating, and like I said, there's so much resources online that it takes the responsibility off you, and you can just say, hey, look at this, look at this, look at that. If you got any questions, let me know. And the way that I phrase this when I'm dealing with clients all the time is, this is what I do. This is what I would do. And so it's more of, here, I'm putting that out there. You have your free will. You make your choice. You're not going to just take a piece of paper, write everything down, here, follow this plan, right? That's what some clients want. They just want to keep it easy, but that's against the law. And not that anyone's going to come after and sue you, but I am always reminded of when Bailey's, the health club that was around, Total Fitness, there was a big lawsuit there for someone that got hurt or injured. I forgot the consequence to the client, but the person, this is when ephedra was really big and the fat loss supplement, and the personal trainer had written down like a very regimented supplement plan and nutritional aspect, and got the personal trainer didn't get sued. They were included in the lawsuit, but the fitness facility was because they're the ones with all the money. So there can be consequences in that aspect. That's why you should always post it as education and education only. It's not as severe as like when you're doing like fitness assessments and you're dealing with like the blood pressure and you're telling someone that diagnosed with a condition that, oh, you have hypertension. But it can be consequential if someone ends up getting hurt, particularly with supplements. Supplements are usually pretty benign, but particularly the ones that are fat loss, that are stimulants, like the caffeine, the ephedra mix, that was some it was really good shit, but it was too good, right? It was banned for a while, and then the FDA got slapped because it was outside the purview of supplementation. So it's back on the market, but just with warnings. So your textbook chapter, the one for the essentials of personal training, really talks about scope of practice, talks about the role, and goes right into the standard fare of this is what the government says, follow this guideline, right? And that's a good starting point for some people. It does get into like carbohydrates and fats and the macronutrients a little bit, and then it skims over that and goes right into water and hydration, which is the second round of videos that I'm going to be posting next week, which is micronutrients like vitamins, minerals, and water hydration. Now, I provided again from the Essentials of Strength and Conditioning extract of this chapter. This one's a little bit more scientific, and it gets into more detail when it comes to the macronutrients. And so it does also talk about the scope of practice and the roles of nutrition, but it goes into the basic guidelines and all the garbage, but it does go into more detail in terms of the macronutrients and the dietary references. And I provided this chapter because it's a better chapter textbook for nutrition. It goes into more details of what we're talking about, goes into the different amino acids and all that stuff. And that's what the next 3 videos that I posted: carbohydrates and insulin, protein, and fat. Now I did a little bit more in this video than I wanted to. Normally I just have it just a straight up carbohydrate, talking about what carbohydrates are, and then the physiological effect I usually provide in module 10. But I found it hard, and I found it was going to be redundant. So this video is the longest. I think it's like 26 minutes. And the rest of these guys are short. They're under like 10 or 15 minutes here. Let me see what this one, I think this one's even shorter. Maybe longer, actually, 15 minutes. So I provided more information than needed for the carbohydrate, but it really gets into the physiological effect. And for fat loss, and fat loss specifically, it's really important to understand carbohydrate because it's been so well, not so much protein, but carbohydrate and fat has really been demonized in terms of carbohydrates. First, fats were bad, and then carbohydrates were bad, and protein got a free ride. But in the end, as you'll look from these videos, is that they all have their metabolic consequences. It all depends on if that's what you're looking for or not. And it really comes down to insulin, right? Carbohydrates, the most insulin producing. Protein is half, about 50% the insulin production, and then fat is virtually negligible. So fat becomes your primary. Then where this gets into the play a lot is in this whole aspect of ketogenesis and ketosis and all those things. So there's a lot of information here, and it goes beyond what you're going to get in your NTR 101 class that you take, your nutrition. Your nutrition class is going to talk about what a macro, micro, and what's really going to get into. It's going to be all these RDIs, these recommended dietary allowances, RDAs, and intake forms and all that. It's going to look at calorie count and how many things people should be eating. And again, it's all waste of freaking time. And not that it's a waste of time, but when you look at the priority for what actually gets result in fitness and performance, I use the example, and I forgot to put it in the video, and I'm going to do it because it's such a good one. If you were going to go on a road trip, what would be like the top 3 or 4 things that you would check in your car before you ventured on your journey? Most people say make sure your gas is filled, right? And then the next 2 are usually like make sure you have your tire, check your tires, right? Make sure your tire pressure is there. And then you probably get your oil changed, right? So those will be your top 3 things. Is there anything else that you would do before not like what you would pack, but you would inspect on your car before you heading out on your journey? What else? Like engine coolant? Yeah, but that's usually not a big deal. You're usually not leaking there. It would be your next thing, right? It's not a deal breaker. Like you run out of gas, you get a flat tire, and your engine oil, your car's toast. You run out of windshield wiper fluid, big deal, right? It's inconvenience. Counting calories and really looking at all those specifics is on par with focusing on your windshield wiper fluid. So while you're spending all this time and energy trying to looking up calories and trying to figure out how many and keeping your calories under low, you're neglecting other things that pay off in terms of your physiological responses. And I share them in the bioenergetics aspect, like the quality of the food you're eating, the timing of food is ridiculously crazy in terms of how much effect it has, regardless of the total caloric intake, right? You can take two groups, and 10 when we talk about metabolism, you can take two groups of mice, rats, or subjects, and this works in humans too, but they controlled it with rats, and you can give them the exact same amount of calories, exact same, and you can give them a diabetes, obesity inducing, so high fat, high carbohydrate, right? Those are the two worst combination of macronutrients to induce, like high fat, high carb, not carb by itself or fat by itself, but those two things together. And you give one group of rats 12-hour feeding window, and you give another group of rats unlimited feeding window. The one that has unlimited feeding window, where they're eating all throughout the day, 24 hours, obesity, diabetes, inflammation marker, cardiovascular disease, all the shit that goes with degenerative aspect, right? The group that's 12 hours, none of these markers. You flip groups and it changes, right? The ones that were originally obese and the pre-diabetic, they end up dropping down. So no caloric change, no quality change, just the total timing of the food aspect. And that has to do with feeding windows. And we'll talk more about that in the next week when we look at the next module. But it just goes to show that let the registered dietitians do their thing. Let them virtue signal on they're helping people do their thing. But in the end, when it comes down to it, physiology is more important than government recommendations. And understanding the physiology, like you're going to understand these, it starts with the macronutrients, is the first step. And then we eventually start going through how do you manipulate other lifestyle factors like sleep, light exposure, hydration status, and the micronutrients to optimize your physiological environment, which is what your goal is with your clients. And you're not doing it to treat a disease. You're not trying to fix cardiovascular disease, or you're doing it so that they have enhanced performance, which is part of your overall training goals in the first place, right? One step back is the training that you design from your exercise program, the variables you manipulate. The two steps forward is the lifestyle modifications that you're trying to have your client adhere to, which is what they're putting into their mouth, what they're thinking about between their ears, and how much sleep they're getting, right? So that's all encompassing of a fitness professional and what you're doing. So yeah, that's my rant for our role in nutrition. So what you'll find in this video is you'll learn about the carbohydrates, and I have the PowerPoint pulled up here, so we'll go. And the biggest takeaway from this particular video is that all carbohydrate, no matter if it's complex or simple, good or bad, starchy or sugary, its final destination after it gets into the mouth from digestion, its final destination is sugar, right? Everything's converted to sugar. So it doesn't matter how complex your carbs are, how healthy they are, how green they are, how colorful they are, they all end up as this freaking molecule right here, which is a monosaccharide. And you have three primary monosaccharides. You have glucose, galactose, and fructose. And none of them are bad, none of them are good. It's just sugar. And it's the currency the body has, right? The plant, through photosynthesis, is taking sunlight and taking carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and water from the ground, and it's making these sugars, and it's the plant's energy. And the plant is then complexing those by adding sugars together. So you're going from monosaccharides, right, through this process of photosynthesis, and you're making disaccharides, which are all these monosaccharides with a glucose molecule added to it. So this is table sugar. This is the sugar that you find in milk and dairy. And then this is maltose, which is usually made from barley or grains that are roasted because you're breaking down the long chains. And then that process of photosynthesis, where the plant is making its cellular structure, right? It's making its seeds and its stems and its roots. All of this is coming from carbon dioxide and sunlight. And these are nothing more than complex sugars. And the sugars can get really complex, like this, where they have more than two in their long chain, or they can get really complex where they're becoming starchy, right, for energy storage, or they can start to become structural, like cellulose, and eventually so structural that they become wood. So everything you see in the fruit tree, from the bark to the roots to the leaves to the pit to the stem to the fruit that we eat, is all from sugar, just more complex put together. We, because of our digestive system, can't access any of those complex carbs, right? The only thing, because of the transit time from when we eat to when we poop, that's about 6 to 12 hours. And the amount of time that material is there, We don't have enough time to break that down. So really complex chains like this, if you eat it, you're going to poop it out. Even cellulose, even like, so like this is wood, cellulose here, even some of the long chain starches, that's glycogen, sorry. These long amylase chains, we might be able to cleave a couple of the glucose molecules off, but for the most part, we eat it, we poop it. And that's the whole point of eating fiber. Cellulose is basically fiber, your dietary fiber. You eat it and it sits in your gut, and it's meant to help with roughage, but what it's really doing is there's a, let me see, I have another slide that talks about the microbiomes. Thought I had a slide that talked about the microbiomes. I do not. Maybe it's down here. Well, anyways, this whole process is driven by a whole by microbes. There's a whole microbiology, microflora that exists within the gut, and what your fiber is really doing is it's feeding your gut flora, and the bulk of your poop, of your feces, is actually dead bacteria, right? It's undigested material and dead bacteria from just their life cycle. And the fiber goes through, and it's basically ineffective carbohydrate because the body can't access it. And yeah, so it's not what you eat, it's what you absorb. And even though you're eating fiber, even though you eat the fiber and it has an energy yield, if I burn it in a bomb calorie meter, it really doesn't add to the total caloric intake. So you can eat 10 grams of fiber. That would be equivalent of 40 calories, which is 10 grams of fiber would be like 10 teaspoons of sugar, right? The same amount of calories from 10 teaspoons of sugar, which is about the same amount of sugar that's in a serving of Coca-Cola, or soda, whatever, a pop. And you would eat 40 calories worth of energy, and you probably poop out 39 calories worth of energy because your body can't access it. But on the food label, if you had someone diligently counting their calories, they would overestimate their calories by 40. And the foods that your clients and you should be eating should be high fiber foods anyway. So you're offsetting your caloric intake. So anyways, again, it's not what you eat, it's what you absorb. And all carbohydrates, regardless if they are, whoops, where am I at here? I'm way low. Regardless if they're potatoes or cherries or celery or M&Ms or white bread or whole grain bread, it's going to end up as sugar at some point in your gut, right? The question is how fast does this sugar get into the blood? Your blood can only handle 4 grams of sugar at any given time, right? That's not a lot. That's not even a whole heaping teaspoon. And if you look at your sugar labels, your food labels, you find that there's a shit ton of sugar in almost everything that we eat. Your body's capacity for sugar storage is limited, as we learned from the last lectures or last module, that you can only store about 400 calories or 100 grams in the liver, and you can only store about 500 grams or 2,000 calories in the muscle. And sugar that's stored in the muscle is locked in the muscle. It can't be released for other things. So if your heart or brain needs sugar, and let's say you have a full tank of sugar in your glutes, body can't access it. It's only accessible to the working muscle, and only or mostly in the glycolytic state. So only when you're doing high intensity activity. Outside of that, any excess carbohydrate, so you eat all this carbohydrate, it's going to turn into sugar. It's going to break it down, whether it's this healthy carb or this unhealthy carb. Those are bad terms, and it's going to end up in the bloodstream. And as you eat, your blood sugar levels are going to elevate, and your body's going to have to do something about it, because outside of this range between 70 and 140, the body freaks out. If it gets too low, freaks out. If it gets too high, freaks out. When I say freaks out, it means it mounts a very aggressive physiological response to bring blood sugar levels right here. And the reason why it does that is that your nervous tissue, particularly your brain, does not have the ability to store energy. Just not like the muscles. The muscles have their own storage supply, right? And they can use fat, ketones, they can use everything. The nervous system, the brain particularly, doesn't have that same mechanism for storage. So it is 100% dependent upon blood sugar levels to maintain its metabolic output. And so the body bases all of its physiological system, it bases homeostasis on this sugar level. And so if it gets too high, it has to bring it down, gets too low, has to bring it up. The other thing is that sugar in the blood is toxic. It's a pro-inflammatory and like, if you want to think about it as an oxidizing component, it creates damage within the blood vessel itself, right side in the lumen. So you get these they're called AGEs, advanced glycation end products. And the sugar reacts with the lumen in here, and it's actually elevated blood sugar levels that contribute to the plaques and the arteriosclerosis in the blood vessel. The body gets damaged within that blood vessel. This is totally tangential right now, but I'm going to go on anyways because it's exciting stuff. Cholesterol, like that inside of that lumen is like your skin. And if you cut your skin, you get a scab. You do not want scabs in your blood vessel because it ends up turning into a clot. So your body heals inside its lumen by adding down like a waxy plaque layer made up of cholesterol, right? Cholesterol got the blame for cardiovascular disease because those plaques are made up of cholesterol. But the reason why they're there in the first place was because of damage to that lumen. So either some kind of oxidized fat, chemical damage, or in this case, a lot of times it's the elevated blood sugar levels and insulin. So the cholesterol, it's like, it'd be like someone calling the fire department because someone called the fire alarm, but someone called the fire alarm because of they saw smoke and fire. And instead of addressing the fire itself, we just said, hey, let's get rid of the fire alarms and we wouldn't have the alarm problem anymore, right? But it still didn't change the problem, right? We have all these cholesterol lowering medications and cardiovascular disease is still rampant, right? There's like virtually no difference in terms of deaths from cholesterol lowering medications, particularly like with women. There is no scientific evidence or no epidemiological evidence that shows that cholesterol lowering medication even changes heart disease. So people die just as much with high cholesterol from cardiovascular disease as they do from low cholesterol from cardiovascular disease. Like there's no difference at all. Now, the consequence from cardiovascular medication or cholesterol medication is brain decline and muscle weakness, but who cares, right? Because as long as our heart is, who knows? But anyways, blood sugar is a major thing that your body tries to manage. And the only way that it can manage it is by taking blood, sugar out of the blood, and it can put 100 grams into the liver, top that guy off. You can put 500 grams into the muscle, top that guy off. And then once it's at capacity, once this is at capacity, the body has no other place but to put it as fat. You have a limited supply of sugar in the liver and muscle. You have a unlimited supply in the fat tissue, right? Not unlimited, near limitless. You do get to a point where you at capacity, and then this is where you start to get the activation of the stem cells and your body starts going through hyperplasia and adding on more fat tissue. And it's just a fun process. And you end up with fatty liver disease. You end up with lots of subcutaneous fat, and then you end up with lots of visceral fat because the onslaught of sugar is way too much. And it's not so much the onslaught of sugar as it is a desensitization to insulin. Your body's not able to do as much with that. The insulin is too long, and the insulin is not as effective as it could be. And so part of your training regimens, and it's a byproduct of intermittent fasting, low carbohydrate intake, and high intensity exercise, one of the major players in that is this resensitization of insulin. And so that's what we're going to talk about next week in terms of metabolism and mitochondria function. That's the main benefit of exercise, is that resensitization of insulin. So your body doesn't need to release as much to keep your sugar levels low. And the other aspect is if you're getting off your butt and you're doing some glycolytic activity, you are creating reservoirs, you're draining your reservoirs, you're creating a buffer for how much sugar you can actually eat, right? So you are craving for cookies, pizza, and Pepsi Cola, right? And you want like the real Pepsi, not the fake artificial shit. And so you're going to pound, your meal's going to be like almost 600 grams of carbohydrates right there. Do it post squat day, post leg day. Virtually none of it's going to be stored as body fat. Do it on a rest day, and you haven't done, or you, and none of us are guilty of this, but you introduce that same meal to a sedentary population that has spent very little time in the glycolytic state. All of that's going into body fat, right? There's virtually no reduction in muscle glycogen or liver glycogen. They're just not getting that turnover. So you can see that the meals that you eat aren't dependent just upon the food you eat. It's dependent upon what you've also done, right? What you did an hour or two before. Did you drain the swamp and you got rid of all the glucose or glycogen in the muscles, and now you have a buffer? You can eat pretty much anything you eat is going to be replenishing muscle glycogen, right? To a limit, right? But you got to get the point of there's better times to eat shittier food. So what ends up happening, and the big consequence of this, and I'll just put the whole slide up here, is that Insulin elevated because of blood sugar levels, it drives sugar into the liver, into the muscles, and into the fat. And these cells are one way. So once the insulin comes here and opens this channel up, sugar's coming in, nothing can come out. So whenever you have an elevated blood sugar level, your body stops fat burning. So all of that all the stored fat you have on your body, all the stored fat that your client's trying to get rid of, is excess carbohydrate that was consumed at some point in their life, right? Or and excess fat, but excess energy. And your body, in order to burn that, has to be in a hypoglycemic, optimized insulin environment in order for the fat cells to open up. If there's a plentiful amount of sugar there, the body is not going to tap into that fat. Think of sugar, glucose, blood sugar levels as cash in your pocket, and think of adipose tissue as your bank account. Now you're out shopping, and this is like normal aspect that we're going to get back to next spring, hopefully. And you're going to go into a store and purchase something. You're not going to go to the ATM and get cash out because you already have cash in your pocket. So you're going to go through all of the cash in your pocket first before you even think about going to an ATM or using your debit card, right? And this is like a cash only business or whatever. You're buying drugs, okay? Because that's the only non-credit card business that's still left. It's not true, like because marijuana. So like, you're going to go buy some like psychedelics, and you need cash. You're not going to go to the ATM to do that because you have plenty of cash in your pocket. Think of sugar and fat that same way. Your body is going to preferentially burn sugar first, not because it likes to, because it has to, right? Let's say you're going to go buy you're in the black market and you're going to go into a shady area. You don't want to carry that much cash around with you. You want to get through your cash as quickly as possible, because if you get mugged, you're going to lose cash. But if they get your ATM, you're going to get that money back, right? So you're going to preferentially burn that. You're going to get rid of that cash as quickly as possible, and you're going to use that first, and then you're going to go to your ATM. So hopefully that analogy is really dark and somewhat licit, but whatever. It's fun. And you have that concept that sugar is burned first. And so if you have a surplus of sugar, your fat burning is done, right? It's not happening. So in order to burn body fat, mobilize body fat, you have to optimize your insulin levels, and you have to keep your glucose levels relatively low, right? Luckily, that happens when you start training. When you start exercising, your body's going to rapidly burn through the glycogen because you're in the glycolytic system, and hopefully you're monitoring your food intake so that you're just under threshold for carbohydrate, right? And this is why low carbohydrate diets have been wildly successful at losing body fat, not necessarily losing weight, but losing body fat, was because of that reduction in glucose. Now, the problem with low carb diets is that fat as the macronutrient is always looked upon as the demonized macronutrient. Instead of going low carb and increasing fat intake, what people have gone carb and they've increased protein intake. And not that protein is a bad thing to go to, but when you look at insulin production, you see that carbohydrate is the most insulin producing macronutrient. And you can see protein is, and fat is about a 10th or a 12th of that. So when you look at like the insulin environments, protein is still pretty insulin producing, and any excess protein that's beyond your body's ability to utilize is converted to sugar. So think of protein as a special sugar. The first 20 or 30 grams of it that you eat, the body can utilize, but anything per meal, and you look at like a total of like 50 to 60 grams per day, anything excess is expensive carbohydrate. You think of when you buy a steak, and the steak is $14 a pound, and you look at a box of macaroni, and that's $1.99 a pound. Basically, anything after 30 or 40 grams of protein is basically really expensive carbohydrate. So I kind of say in the video that I still eat big steak, but I'm eating the steak because what you find in nature is you find protein and fat usually bound together, or you'll find carbohydrate and protein bound together. What you will not find in nature outside of breast milk or any kind of dairy is you will not find a food that's naturally high in carbohydrate and fat. You won't find it anywhere. It doesn't exist in nature. And it's this relationship between carbohydrate and fat that is unnatural, that lends itself to overeating. And the example that I give all the time is, if I gave you a bowl of sugar, how much of that could you eat? I mean, depending upon how motivated you were, if I said I was going to give you $100 to eat a bowl of sugar, you could probably get a couple, like I know I could probably get a couple teaspoons in, tablespoons, but at that point I'm done. Like that's just, I'm just disgusted thinking about it. I gave you a bowl of butter. How many spoonfuls can you eat? I could probably do more butter than I could sugar, but by the time I get to the fourth tablespoon of butter, I think I'm done, right? Now let's combine carbohydrate and fat, and I give you a bowl. Now you're asking me how many bowls do I need to get through, right? And because you've just overridden all the natural aspects that exist there, because sugar and fat combined together does something crazy within the brain and does something crazy within the taste buds and overrides any of our natural tendencies to for self-regulation. Because sugar and fat don't exist in nature, right? So ice cream is made up of egg yolk, heavy fat, so cream, and sugar. And if you take cream and whip it, you turn it to butter. So I mean, you can see that it's not too crazy of an aspect, but you can see that it overrides. That's why after a full meal, you've eaten, you pounded a full like meal. Oh, I still have room for dessert because sugar and fat override that. And the issue is that things that are naturally sweet in nature tend to have high amounts of nutrients that are coming along with it. And fat is a hard thing to come by. And so the body, from a survival aspect, wants that in the diet. So it's going to take it in as much as it can for the anticipation of a famine that may be coming or may not.
Um,
Yeah,
can our taste buds adapt? Like if we stay away from, let's say, dairy, like is our taste buds gonna not want dairy as much as we did before moving that from the diet, or
it's not the dairy; it's the combination of sugar and fat. Yeah, so it's not that your body craves dairy. I could use coconut oil instead, right? I can
mm,
use it can be any kind of fat.
yeah.
So it's just the fact that it's a fat and a sugar, but that overrides the way that they work together smooths things out and becomes this like luxurious thing that is unsatiable.
Mm.
You eventually become satiated because your stomach is so full. But just think about it. Think about when I say just a bowl of sugar, you're looking at I can probably force, and you can say a bowl of butter, you can probably force a couple tablespoons in. But when it comes to ice cream, you're like, I can polish off a whole pint. Yeah, okay, no problem, right? And it doesn't even register that that's an issue, right? Unless you have a long history of lactose intolerance and you think an ice cream gives you like the shits, and then you're never going to want to eat ice cream. But you can replace it with any type of example.
Mhm.
Salt does this as well. Like, have you ever eaten unsalted potato chips or unsalted nuts before? You're only going to eat a few. But when you have that salt aspect, salt in nature is usually not that concentrated. It's usually balanced with potassium and other macros or other micros. And so what ends up happening with sodium is that because of that imbalance, the body wants more, right? It's an unnatural thing, and it just feels so good that you're going to want to do that. And food manufacturers play around. And there's a whole bunch of things that are if things are imbalanced, you're going to have that desire to eat more, and that's why you can pound a bag of chips because of that salt aspect without the associated potassium and that high concentration. But just to that point, crazy, right? It's like magic. But they know it. And that's how they sell food, right? They got to sell it. Certain colors can change your. It's just there's a whole magic behind it. So I'm not going to share all of it, but there's tons of stuff for you to kind of look at on your own. Okay, so I got on that because of the carbohydrate and fat and protein. And when you start choosing food sources, if you don't focus on protein and you focus on fat, you tend to get all the protein that you need. So this whole aspect of protein supplementation and that you need a lot of protein has really been driven by the supplement manufacturers, and particularly ones that are trying to sell protein powders. So the myth of eating 5 or 6 meals a day, probably the worst thing that you could do because of the insulin responses, right? If we look at like your total insulin, every time you eat, you have an insulin spike and you're in fat storage mode. And then when you're not eating, you have that fat burning mode. And if I spread this out even further and put 3 more meals in there, this was a myth driven by supplement manufacturers that wanted to sell meal replacement. It was hard for them to have people give up a meal and do a meal replacement. So they said, oh, let's just eat 2 or 3 additional meals throughout the day and supposedly keep our insulin levels stable. The problem is that you're keeping your insulin levels elevated and you are halting fat burning. And this is why intermittent fasting has become pretty popular, not because it's a fad, because it's effective. And it's not a fad because it's been around for centuries. And what ends up happening is you end up tying things down to a tighter feeding window. You can eat the same amount of calories, right? Whether you eat over 12 hours, 8 hours, or 4 hours. And you can see what happens is that you get this insulin spike for storage, which is good, particularly if this is post workout. And then everything that follows or precedes is, and you're in a hypoglycemic state, which is keeping your body sensitive to insulin and utilizing stored fat for fuel instead of the glucose that you just eaten, right? And then I'll talk more about this next week in terms of intermittent fasting, fasting, and metabolism or metabolic manipulation. Okay, so that was talking about carbohydrate. Yeah, and again, it's not that carbohydrate's bad, it's just carbohydrate has a consequence to it. And the amazing thing about carbohydrate is that it's a non-essential nutrient, right? You do not need to get it in your diet. There is no monosaccharide or disaccharide, so some kind of sugar molecule that your body needs to get, right? It doesn't mean that it doesn't have use for it. It just means that you do not need to get it in your diet. Your body can manufacture all of the carbohydrate that it needs to from glycerol and amino acids. So this is where you would probably overeat some of the protein if you're not eating carbohydrate. I said, but you are you're keeping you're forcing the body to use the carbohydrate that it needs, right? If you're trying to save money or be effective with your eating, or because what carbohydrates tend to do is, we'll talk about it in the micronutrients, is that they tend to be the largest vehicle for vitamins and minerals, right? Fats and proteins don't lend itself to that high of a nutrient turnover. They have a high macronutrient turnover, but in terms of micronutrients, in terms of the B vitamins and the vitamin C and so forth, and the minerals, these are usually coming along with plant materials. So when people argue that you need carbohydrates, they're correct. You don't need carbohydrates. You need the things that come along with carbohydrates. So it's not that you need to hit a certain amount of percentage of your caloric intake, macronutrient carbohydrate. It's just that the micronutrients that come along with that, you need those things. You want a certain amount of fiber, and that only comes from carbohydrate sources. So what that makes you do is, when you start picking carbohydrates that you're going to consume, you're going to start to weigh between energy dense, things that have a lot of macronutrient value but not a lot of micronutrients with it, compared to things that are energy or nutrient dense that have lots of nutrients, so lots of fiber, lots of vitamins and minerals, and maybe a low amount of energy, carbohydrate. And that's when you start to get the comparison between, I don't have a slide in here, and I probably should have, like when you look at carbohydrates, particularly, let's go look up here. If I look at 50 calories worth of energy and I pick it out of this food group here, that might be an entire apple. That might be 5 strawberries. That would be 1 slice of bread. And if I look at like green leaf vegetables, if I look at 50 calories worth of I'm saying 50 calories, let's say 20 grams. That's like a whole bag of lettuce, right? So when you look at the bulk of produce, not fruit even, but people think that like sugar is very, like fruit is very sugary. It is, right? In terms of energy aspect, it is definitely more than carbohydrate, but man, I want to get a whiteboard real quick. Let me see how I can do that. I want to be able to draw. All right, this is good enough. So if I were to rank like carbohydrates from their energy density to so this would be like really high energy dense, and this would be low energy density. You would rank it like this. You would put like your vegetables here. You would put your fruits here. Whoops. You would put your maybe whole grains here, and then you'd put your refined grains here, right? That's how you would rank it, right? And that's true. Like in terms of like your energy density to nutrient density, I would probably rank it 1, 2, 3, and 4, right? The problem is it's not scaled to aspects. It's not like this is first place, second place, third place, fourth place, and this is the way that it would really be is you would have fruits and Sweet. Oh, come on. You'd have fruits and vegetables here, and you would actually then have your it's my first time using this, so sorry. So that's how it would be. So yes, vegetables are definitely better than fruits, but fruits aren't like really bad. They're just a little bit more energy dense than your vegetables. And some argue that your fruits tend to have more vitamin C and more micronutrients in some cases, some aspects. Then you look way down here, and yes, your refined white flour, most amount of energy and the least amount of nutrition. And it doesn't mean that whole grains are twice as good. It means that they're just slightly better, but they both suck when it comes to nutrient and energy density. Why whole grains are more beneficial than white refined flour is they have a little bit more fiber, maybe 2 or 3 more grams, which is great. Not nearly the amount of fiber that produce has. And they have a little bit more of the mineral content, most of the time because it's fortified artificially, not naturally from the soils. So when you're looking at carbohydrate selections, you want to make sure you're picking things that are energy dense, because when you eat carbohydrate, no matter if it's complex or simple, so like if you're in, let me see, how do I get out of the annotation? If I'm here, let's go to this slide. You look at honey here and you say, oh, that's a simple carbohydrate, that's bad for you. I would actually argue that honey is probably more beneficial for you than like this potato, right? Even though this is a complex carbohydrate, this has more nutrition, and you're probably not going to eat as much of it as you are going to eat this guy here. You want to look for energy versus nutrient density. And everything you see here, all these carbohydrates, everything you see here has a metabolic consequence of having a blood sugar level elevation. The question is how pronounced is that going to be? Is that going to be a really tall spike, or is it going to be more of a blunted response? And that's when we start looking at how processed or how refined or how natural state your carbohydrates are. And if you look at like here, this is the zone you want to try to keep your blood sugar level in. Foods that are really refined or highly processed, you're going to get a huge blood sugar spike and then a concomitant crash later. Versus things that are maybe moderately complex but still refined, you're still going to get this big spike. And then things that are more blunted, and I would not put whole grains there because whole grains here and there, but you're going to you're going to have more of this lob than this spike, and you kind of want to keep your sugar levels within that aspect. If you can keep it metabolically going where your body's using, you won't have that huge crash and that insulin release. And again, it's all about keeping insulin levels as blunted as possible. And this is looking at your blood sugar levels, not necessarily your insulin response. And the way you look at that is you look at like this glycemic index of foods, like foods that are rated based on how much of a blood sugar influence they have. You can look at the insulin index, and these are all things you can look up, but it's better to qualify carbohydrates from some kind of index, whether it's the glycemic index, the glycemic load, or the insulin index, to really see how fast it's getting in your bloodstream. And the easiest way of doing this is the more processed it is, the worse it's probably going to be for the body. All grains, unless you're taking whole oats and you're cooking them for hours at a time, if you're turning that into like a bread or cereal, it's processed. That's really processed, and it's going to have an effect on blood sugar levels. If you're taking a fruit and you're cooking it down and turning it into jam, you're really processing that. Fiber and acid and water, they blunt the insulin response. So when a food product like a berry or an apple has lots of water, lots of fiber in it, when you eat that apple, you're going to eat a whole apple and you're not going to get a big insulin spike. If I take that apple and I juice it or I cook it down, I'm going to process it and I'm going to get a stronger insulin response from it, maybe even getting more calories out of it than I would have in the first place. So the things in their raw state are probably better for you long term.
So does that mean like if you say like made like protein pancakes and stuff and you put like the like blueberries or something in it? Oh, is he gone?
I'm listening. Yeah, you're right. You're right.
Yeah, so doing that is the same thing. It's watering it down pretty much. Just putting putting blueberries in the mix and then cooking it.
Well, you're trying to make blueberry pancakes, right?
Yeah, pretty much.
You're just adding a flavor. And how many blueberries are you getting per, like 4?
Yeah, I mean, I don't take like it's not a handful, definitely not. Maybe just like 4 or 5
I mean, I
ish.
think in this case, you're splitting hairs, whether you're cooking blueberries or like I'm thinking more like you're simmering blueberries down to make a sauce and that type of
Uh,
thing, right?
oh,
That
more
you
like straight up just draining it rather kind of.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
You're fine. I mean, so that's a different aspect. But now the protein pancakes, you're using probably like a pea protein and a soy protein, and those tend to have a decent amount of carbohydrate with them. And I would be suspect of that glycemic response for those type of compounds.
Oh, okay.
And again, when you look at the video on protein, uh, people overdo it, right? Protein, all the stuff you see here, and especially protein products have become really big. They had soy protein, and then you had the whole ketogenic movement to try to really increase fat and get away from carbs and create a lot of non-carbohydrate carb food. So like cereals and breads that are made out of like pea protein. And I eat that stuff. I don't stay away from it. I eat a lot of like ketogenic cereals because I like that crunchy, that mouth feel from a crunch. And it's made out of pea protein and a little bit of fiber there. I'm gonna mute you, Jobin, because that thing you're doing is annoying the hell out of me. I'm sorry. You know
Okay,
what?
really quick, I have a question.
Well, can I just tell? Okay, go
Yeah,
ahead.
yeah.
No, go
No,
ahead.
you
I'm
go.
joking.
Okay, so as a general rule, I thought that like the amount you weigh is the grams that you have in protein.
Say that again.
Like, for example, if someone weighs 120 pounds, they have to eat 120 grams of protein. Is that valid or?
Yeah. So the RDA is about zero point 0.8 grams per 1 kilogram of body weight. So that's at a sedentary individual and 1.7. So that's looking at if you were a 170-pound person, that would be about 50 grams of protein. Again, it's not what you eat, it's what your body can process, absorb, and anabolically handle. And so any excess protein is converted to sugar. And when you look at some of the protein requirements, like when you look at 3 ounces or 100 grams, this is equivalent to a deck of playing cards. So if you took a deck of playing cards, that's how big that salmon fillet is, or that's how big that chicken breast is. That's about all you can handle in one meal, one sitting, right? That's how much amino acids can be broken down and absorbed into the tissue. It's not like protein absorption is not the same as sugar. Sugar absorption is immediate, right? Cells open up, sucks that sugar in, and it's good. It's storing it as glycogen, and or converting it to fat. Taking amino acids, the way it stores it is by creating protein. So you have to go through the whole protein synthesis, take that amino acid, build it together, and it's a little slower process. So per meal, you're only absorbing about 20 grams of that protein. Your total protein for the entire day is kind of here, and this is the RDA. I actually think this is kind of on the high end because if you're eating enough calories from carbohydrate or fat, your body's not going to utilize that protein, right? So if my goal was pure fat loss and still maintain high levels of performance, I would be eating just enough carbohydrates to maintain my glycolytic state. So how much I'm burning in the glycolytic state to reply that. I would probably go a little bit less carbohydrate and force my body to convert some carbs from the protein and fats that I'm eating. I would eat as much fat as I can tolerate to make sure I hit my caloric intake. And if I'm eating fat, I'm probably going to self-regulate on how much I really need to eat. And if for protein, I would not be looking for excess protein sources. I would think that by me getting this steak here, I'm getting protein I need. That's 75 grams of protein. That's more than enough for me at 190 pounds. That's plenty of protein for what I need for the day, even for an active individual, because my body will take all that protein at some point. And now it would be better to kind of spread that out. But if you think about carnivorous animals, they eat like once or every other day, maybe once a week, right? They'll have one kill, and that's enough for them to restore all of their tissues. Right now, they're not active in exercising stress, so um, the protein recommendations, like for the protein shakes, if you think about a whole protein shakes, like 25 grams of protein, right? That's almost half of your aspect. So if you're eating a normal, like you're eating grains and cheese, dairy, eggs, and so forth, you're getting a lot of protein, and I mean, protein powders are expensive. They're really expensive, and they're not really satiating. And here's the problem with dairy. Dairy is the most insulin producing protein. Whey protein is the highest out of all that. So whey protein is an insulin producing aspect. So if you're interested in fat loss, you shouldn't be using whey protein at all, right? Whey protein, when you look at dairy protein, so you look at milk where it makes some cheese. In order to make that cheese is mostly what's called casein protein. And when you add an acidifying agent to the or emulsifier, or I forgot the term that they use, but when you add it to dairy, you get a separation of casein protein, so the curds, the milk solids, and then you get a separation of the milk liquid, which is the whey. And whey was an industrial byproduct for a long time, a waste product from cheese manufacturing, because there was really nothing they can do with it. They would try to take the whey protein and feed it to cattle, but not to cattle, but they feed it to hogs, and they would try to use it for weight gain. And then they found a way to take the whey protein and micronize it and make it more mixable, so it was a more powderized form. Whey protein powders over the last decade have gotten even better. I mean, now you can mix it up and it's clear liquid. Before it was like a chalky type substance, and even before that, it was just impalatable. That's why it was better to drink raw eggs than it was to try to drink a protein powder 25 years ago. I'm actually more than that, like 30 years ago. Think of Rocky Balboa drinking the eggs. That was preferable over the protein powders at the time, right? So that just kind of gives you that comparison. So they found a way to process the whey protein powder, make it more digestible, and it's just not, it's a byproduct. It's there. They found a way to capitalize on it. And it's insulin producing, so it's going to put on muscle mass, but it's insulin producing, so it's going to could put on fat mass as well. So if your goal was you're training really hard and you're an athlete competitive, I would probably do a whey protein shake post workout, but that's the only time I would do it. I wouldn't do it in the day or later. And I'm only doing it to get an insulin response, but there's better ways of getting insulin response without having to do a protein shake, right? That would probably be the time that I would want to get my carbohydrate intake in, so I can replace my carbohydrates, get an insulin spike, and then also be a vehicle to get all the nutrients, the micronutrients that I needed, and have my carbohydrate intake post strength training, not conditioning, strength training. Yeah, so hopefully that answered that question, Julie, because like you're saying per gram of body weight, and but that's what the recommendation is here. This is the RDA, is this one here, and it should be about 10 to 20, 35%. And again, the only reason why you need protein is to make sure you have available amino acids for tissue repair. And as long as you have enough carbohydrate and protein or fat intake, your body's going to spare protein for metabolism. It's going to use it just for the building blocks. It won't take the amino acids, convert them to energy if it has plenty of sugar and fat around.
Oh, okay. So what about like whey, like isolated ones, protein shake?
Same. It's whey, it's dairy, it's insulin producing.
Yeah, that's what I thought. Okay. I don't remember I forgot what you were talking about before you answered her, but something about like protein pancakes or something.
Well, you were talking about protein pancakes with the powdered and stuff, and I just think I mean, I like the pea proteins. Soy protein, I think is the worst thing you can take. But especially for as a guy, because it's the xenoestrogens and stuff in it. But the pea proteins seem to be okay. So the vegetable proteins. I think cricket protein is probably the best, that made out of insects, right? I think that's probably the most the least insulin producing, and probably if you're going to get a protein in, that would probably be the one to do it. But it's your choice. You can eat crickets or just eat some hamburger. Again, you guys are you're being influenced by the supplement industries that are driven to the bodybuilding, and you just don't need that much protein. You don't, right? Because your body's limited. I think I have a slide in here that talks about it. You're limited how much protein your body can actually use, and anything excess, it gets converted to sugar. And trust me, I would rather eat more protein than eat carbohydrate because of that aspect, but I'd rather just keep my protein levels down and focus more on fat, because I don't want that insulin response. And your whole digestive system was designed to eat higher fat foods, right? Not pure fat like butters and coconut oil, but high fat foods like nuts, seeds, and animal tissues. You know, you weren't designed to drink skim milk. Skim milk is a scam.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. With skim milk.
I mean, we don't even buy milk. We use cream and half for my son for his cereal or whatever, but we don't really do that much dairy. But
yeah, same. I try, if I want to, I try to just do like either, well, my parents get whole milk, but if I get a chance, I go get like almond milk instead.
So you like the juice of nuts? I mean, that's fine, but again, milk is like, why not just do the whole milk? It's probably better for you in the long run for.
Yeah, true. Yeah. And then also my protein pancakes, they only for a serving size, it's only 14 grams of protein and it's like 25 or 30 grams of carbs.
It's a lot. It's a shit ton of carbs.
Yeah. Okay.
But I mean, it's still better than probably the 80 grams of carbs you're going to get from pancake. I mean, I don't, but if you look at regular pancakes from flour, so again, when you work with your clients, there's not going to be good or bad. It's going to be a spectrum of like better choices, and don't forget the psychological aspect of eating, right? Some things just taste really good and you're going to want to eat it, and that's fine. If you're not really striving for 100% compliance when it comes to nutrition. And I think you get a lot. I'll just use this graph here, even though it's not related to that. But if you look at like your progress results, you can see that like early on, you get, let's use this one here. You can get rapidly increased, but as you go on and on, you start to plateau a little bit. And the difference between eating clean 100% of the time and eating clean 90% of the time, in terms of outcomes, it's negligible, right? Now, eating clean 10% of the time versus 90% of the time, there's a big difference there. But really, if that difference from 90 to 100, the psychological benefit of knowing that you can one day just blow it and do whatever the hell you want is a lifesaver versus, nope, I can't ever eat that ever again, right? So just keep that in mind, that it's about relativity, not absolute. And there's a spectrum that exists. And you might have a client down here that's eating McDonald's. I always share the story. When I was training, I had a client that said, is it okay if I eat the number 4 from McDonald's? Like they use that in vernacular, like I was supposed to know what the number 4, that was so common to her as she was eating that she just ordered the number 4 all the time, that she used that in her and so that person there, I'm not going to say, hey, give up carbohydrate soda, and I'm going to start to progress that a little bit more in terms of, okay, well, let's try to reduce McDonald's to twice a day instead of 3 times a day. And you're going to start making your progression from there. Let's try to make one meal a day. Here, go to this website. There's some meal options here that are higher in protein, higher in fat, lower in carbohydrate, and you can kind of start picking from there. And so you're going to transition out. Someone that like yourself that's doing protein pancakes, that's better than doing, you'll hear too, like, oh, I have breakfast. I have a healthy breakfast. I have toast and orange juice and some jam on my toast because it's all low fat. Well, fantastic. But that's like the worst thing you can do that's the best thing you can do to get yourself diabetes, right? Is to have that much carbohydrate first thing in the morning. So you're going to start making these transitions a little different. Let's switch to maybe hard boiled eggs, or do a handful of nuts, or hey, let's try skipping breakfast and see how your body responds to that. So, you're going to progress people through someone that's eating 6 meals a day, you're not going to say, oh, let's get your feeding window down to 4 hours. You're going to first get them to 12-hour feeding windows and see if they can do it within 3 meals. And then it's all going to be a progression. So no good or bad is what I'm trying to say. So that's protein. And then we get to fat, and fat is the most fabulous macronutrient because of this slide right here, that it virtually has no effect on blood sugar levels or insulin levels. And your body doesn't care whether your triglyceride levels are 40 or 400, right? It doesn't have an alarm response. And fat is demonized. And the reason why it was demonized was that fat has 9 calories per gram and carbohydrate and protein have 4 calories per gram. And so back in the 1980s, they thought that if you were to replace your fat with carbohydrate, that you would reduce your total caloric intake and you would lose weight. Well, they failed to take into account the physiological effect of carbohydrate over fat. So you had this huge insulin spike. They also failed to forget that fat keeps you satiated. Like if you eat a high fat meal, you're not going to be hungry for hours later, right? Whereas a high sugar meal, particularly a processed refined, you're going to have a high insulin spike. Your body's going to go into sugar burning mode, and your sugar levels are going to drop because insulin, and you're going to get hungry again right away. Even though you're not energy depleted, you're just hungry. So carbohydrates tend to make you want to eat more throughout the day. That's why more snack foods are carbohydrate based and not protein based, fat based. So fat was demonized, number one, because of the caloric energy density. The other thing why fat was demonized was because of most of the fats that available at the time. When you look at fats in their natural state, the higher fat foods tend to be those from animal products. And those tended to be animal fats because animals use cholesterol. Like cholesterol is to animals what chlorophyll is to plants, right? It's not quite the same for energy production, but our bodies use cholesterol for almost everything: cell structure, cell function, hormone production. And regardless of how much you eat, your body produces cholesterol, right? And so if you eat animals, you're going to get cholesterol from those animal fats. Your body's going to reduce its cholesterol production. And if you're a vegan and you're not eating any cholesterol, your body's going to ramp up its cholesterol production. So your body produces cholesterol regardless of how much you eat or not. There's very little evidence, and that's why the cholesterol recommendations have changed over the last couple decades, that foods that you eat actually elevate your cholesterol levels. And eggs are probably the most concentrated source of cholesterol that we get in our diet. And if you look over the last 2 decades, last 20 years, first eggs were saying don't eat eggs because they're too high in cholesterol. And then they transitioned and said, oh, you can eat 1 egg a day. And just 2 years ago, they said, you can eat as many eggs as you want, because there was no association between dietary cholesterol being ingested and cholesterol levels elevating, right? No randomized controlled studies. So there were some causal relationships there, but nothing that proved that. And that's true, because when you eat foods that are high in cholesterol, your natural cholesterol production lowers, and so your cholesterol levels are going to stay where they want to stay. And if you eat a lot of cholesterol, if you don't eat any cholesterol, your body's going to say, hey, we need cholesterol a little elevated. It's going to elevate it. So cholesterol was, as I said earlier, was negatively associated with heart disease, and said, hey, if you eat cholesterol, it's going to clog your arteries and you're going to die young. And so that's where you got this like saturated artery clogging, saturated fat, which again has 0 randomized control studies that show association between saturated fat intake and cardiovascular disease. Zero. There's epidemiological studies where they show like a relationship, but watching TV is also highly correlated with cardiovascular disease. So again, just cause doesn't imply an effect or outcome. So in the 1980s, everything went fat-free, both because of heart disease and because of energy. And it's about the time that you start to see diabetes and obesity freaking go through the roof, right? We stopped eating fat. We started replacing it with sugar. We switched our fats from natural, unadulterated fats to industrial, polyunsaturated, chemically processed fats. And we're dealing with the aftermath of that now. And you're seeing many cardiovascular surgeons and specialists come out now, because they're the ones that needed to. Coming out against like low fat, high carb diet, cholesterol lowering aspect. And so the new generation of medical doctors that are specialized in cardiology, they are the champions, which they needed to be in order to actually break through the public indoctrination that's happened over the last couple of decades. When trans fats, when margarine was pointed out, when they were trying to replace butter with margarine, they knew back then that trans fats were deadly. There wasn't enough, not deadly, but had compromised onto the health. You think about trans fats now, if you try to go out and find something that has trans fats in it, you're not going to find it. It's outlawed. It's illegal. But this is exactly what was being promoted 20 years ago, of saying, hey, this is going to be better for your health than butter. And now if you do quick search online and say, oh, butter, what's better for me, butter or margarine? I don't think you're going to find anyone that's saying, yeah, your processed vegetable oil is going to be the best thing for you. So that's why people don't tend to put fat in their diet, is because there's a phobia from it, from the cardiovascular disease and from the energy aspect. And that's why when people go low carb, they tended to go low protein. And what they really should have done was gone low carb, gone high fat. You would have gotten enough protein in there, and you would be dealing with a lot of the overeating, metabolic disorders that you get from fats. Now, fats aren't defect free. You have your when you look at your fatty acids, this is a triglyceride. You have your glycerol molecule, and you have your 3 fatty acids there. When you look at here at this carbon chain, this is fully hydrogenated, naturally hydrogenated. That's what a saturated fat is. It's hydrogenated because it has hydrogen in every single one of the carbons. And you have situations like this where you have a double bond where you're unsaturated because you don't have a hydrogen there. So this is a monounsaturated fat because it has one double bond. These are saturated fatty acids. These are medium chain fatty acids because they have a certain amount of carbons, but you can have some fats that are short, that end here, that are short chained, and you can have some that end here, way out here, and they're long chain fatty acids. So you have a lot of diversity in fatty acids. There's probably more, if not the same or more of diversity in fatty acids as there are in amino acids. Aminos, you have about 20, and then those are your 20 foundation, and you have almost 500 that exist from different combinations of those. And you probably have several hundred, if not 1,000 different fatty acids as well. But we categorize them in terms of their saturation. So saturated fats versus an unsaturated fat. This one has to be a polyunsaturated because it has 2 double bonds. And the more double bonds you have, the less stable the fat is, the more sensitive it is to light, heat, and air. When you're saturated, like this, like stearic acid, which is a long chain, which is one of the longer chain fatty acids, it's nearly impenetrable to oxygen, air, and heat. That's why lard, well, actually lard's mostly monounsaturated fat, but that's why like beef fat and bacon fat, rendered fat, or coconut oil, you can deep fry with it. You can keep it out on the shelf. You don't have to refrigerate it, and you can use it for weeks on end because it's stable. It doesn't go bad, right? It's non-reactive to oxygen, air, and light. Olive oil, that's a mostly monounsaturated fat. It has a little bit of resistance, but it has a little bit of weakness because of that double bond. You can keep it out for longer periods of time. It's not as reactive with the air, but it is a little bit more sensitive to light, and it's sensitive to high heat. So you can bake with it and cook with it, but you can't fry with it because it starts to denature the acid. Then you get your crap oils, which are your polyunsaturated fatty acids. These are oils that are very rarely naturally occurring in nature by themselves. These are fats that exist in nuts and seeds, and they are extremely sensitive to air, heat, and light. And that's why they're usually in the shell, in the seed. You can take a corn kernel or a grain or any kind of seed, and you can put it on a shelf, and 5 years, even 10 years can go by. You can plant that seed in the ground, and as long as it was dry and cool and dark, that seed will germinate and seed. Now you'll have some failure, but it's still viable. If I take that seed and I crush it, I crack it, and it's exposed to air, or I get it wet, or I expose it to light, it's non-viable after about 3 or 4 days. Okay, so these fats are the fuel that the seed uses to sprout and grow before it has a chance to photosynthesize energy. That's what the oils are there for in those products. When you cook with these oils, when these are produced, these are considered industrial oils. They have to be done through a factory. Because when you take that seed from the sunflower, or you take that, maybe not sunflower, but like corn oil, rapeseed oil, and peanut oil, any of your industrial food oils, you have to chemically and heat and extract that and chemically separate everything. Then the oils have to be deodorized. They have to be sterilized, and because the oil by itself, it smells, and then it's packaged and bottled and then sold to you as a heart healthy oil. And it's heart healthy because it's cholesterol free, but it's got its own metabolic consequences. So these polyunsaturated fats, these industrial oils, are pretty nasty, right? When you look at the consumption of these over I don't know if I have a slide in it, but yeah. Oh, that's sugar consumption. I thought I had a slide that looked at like proof. So here are your PUFAs. These are the polyunsaturated fatty acids, and these really didn't become popular until right after World War II. And Crisco was the first oil that was produced, and it was actually meant to be an artificial light source for candles. And that's right after the war effort. They had this tooling up for industrial oils, and the war was over, and they needed to figure out a way to do this. And so they said, let's consume it instead. And that's where really the oil started. And that's where you started to get that push, mostly from lobbying from the oil industry, to push these as heart healthy alternatives to cholesterol. And when we look at the fats, when you look here, that we didn't really have a lot of that consumption until after that. And then you had this huge spike. You had another big spike later in the 1990s, and you're starting to see a decline in that, but it's still a pretty dominant oil. So you can see that it really hasn't been around for a long time, 50 years or so. And you can see in the last 50 years how our health has declined. Heart disease, heart disease really didn't exist until like right before the 1950s. It actually became more of an issue after the introduction of the polyunsaturated fatty acids. Correlation, not causation, but a lot of the evidence just shows that saturated fat wasn't the issue. And you can take a polyunsaturated fat and artificially make it saturated by taking it through a process of hydrogenation. So if I take a where am I at here? If I take a unsaturated fat and because it's cholesterol free, so if I take, let's say, vegetable oil, and then I artificially add hydrogen to it, hydrogenation, I can make this fat saturated. The problem is that it instead of being in a natural cis formation, it turns into this transformation. This is where trans fats come from. Your body doesn't know what to do with this fat; it has no idea, right? And it's highly reactive because it's a processed chemical oil and then processed into an artificially saturated fat. And then it's theorized that this is what's causing damage to the lumen on the inside of the blood vessel, and that's what's causing the cholesterol to plaque there. So the recommendation to eliminate these from the diet and add these to the diet probably accelerated the cardiovascular disease in our country, right? So this is something to research and look into and go from there. But I think I've had enough tinfoil hat and soapbox rhetoric for today, but I have more in the video there you can go through. We'll talk about cholesterol a little bit, ketones, and the micronutrients next week. But if you have any other questions, feel free to ask.
So, what's the best oil